Hey everybody, it's hwsteele, and this video is going to be the second installment about the trend duration forecasting method that I had started, I don't know, about what, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, something like that. Now, I'm going to pick up basically where I left off, so if you don't know what I'm talking about, go watch the other video so you can get caught up. I highly recommend it if you haven't. Now, this is a new market. This is, let me pull this down here, Twitter. So I just randomly selected another market that we can use. And the thing that I wanted to point out in this one, I told you in the last one what the very basics of it was, what I started using when I very first decided I'm going to try and use this to see if I can forecast the duration of trends. And so I used what I laid out in that previous video. And then I started paying attention to what happened when I tested it, and one of the very first things that I did to start to, I guess you could say, make changes to this methodology was to look at shorter swings. And this is what I mean by that. Let me move this out of the way. Here we see this, don't worry about this line here, that has nothing to do with this video. Actually, I'll just go ahead and delete it. There we go. So here we have the very bottom of this particular swing right here, right? But we have bottoms that are very close, just a few pennies away from each other, really. So really, technically, it could be any one of these days. That's the absolute lowest point right there. We had a lower close. Zoom in here, make this easier to see. Had a lower close right there. We had a lower close right there than this one, but that's the absolute bottom. So we actually have about a week or so of different days to choose from, so that could make it more difficult. That's one of the things that I started realizing, is that we don't always get sharp tops and sharp bottoms like this or like this right here, where it's obvious which day it is. Sometimes we get drawn out flat bottoms or tops like that, which can make it more difficult. To deal with that, basically what I would do is measure where the bottom starts and where the bottom ends, and then I would average the time out. In other words, pick a day that was right in the middle of that, look at that on the chart right here, see what was going on, and if it didn't have anything on that particular day, which was the average of the 2 days, the front and the end of the sideways move, then I would go back a couple of days, go forward a couple of days, and try and make it excuse me, try and find something that would give us an indication. That's the easy way. The hard way is when you hit that middle day, you look at it on the chart, and you've got 2 or 3 or 4 things astrologically showing up already. So it becomes more difficult in those situations. To rectify that, what I would do is actually just not use that bottom. I know it sounds pretty strange, and I'll go into that more in the next video, but I just want to bring that up because that's one of the first things that I did notice, is that we don't always have sharp tops and sharp bottoms. Sometimes we have this sideways stuff where you would hope that it would be obvious that it's the lowest point, but it doesn't always turn out to be like that. So it's that has to be dealt with, and like I said, probably in the next video, since that's one of the very first things I worked on in this methodology, I'll cover what to do with that. It's not a huge thing, but I wanted to keep it separate from what I was going to talk about in this video, which is one of the things that I noticed was I got far better results using shorter periods of time as opposed to longer periods of time, and this is what I mean by that. I could look at this absolute bottom right here and say, okay, I want to anticipate the end of this major trend, which can be done, but we're looking at a year and a half, or a little over a year, about what, April to June and July of the following year. You hit a lot of different aspects between the fast planets and the slow planets in that period of time. So it became obvious that I was going to have to do something different with what could turn out to be longer periods of time than with the shorter periods of time. So In using the methodology that I laid out, where I look for a relationship between a fast planet and a slow planet, I kept at that point, the swings that I was looking at shorter term. So what that means is if I was really looking at this bottom right here, I would keep it shorter term, and it would probably forecast something like this top or this top. Okay, that's an example of it right there. I'm going to show you another one right here and actually go through the work with it. There was a significant top up here, and then a move down, which didn't take very long at all. And then we moved up for, let's see, the very beginning of April, from April 4th to the highest price, which was June 15th. But we did have a significant amount of sideways movement from the middle of June until close to the end of July. So, what, 5-6 weeks right there of sideways movement. So the reality is that the forecasting method might show, say, maybe this point in time or this point in time, not necessarily the absolute top. So think of it this way. You have a top, might have a double top right there. You have a final top right there. You might hit any one of these three tops with this forecasting method. It's not always the absolute highest point. That's one of the very first things that I started noticing also. It kind of plays into the same thing going on with these lows, the wide lows, and which day do we really use to start the forecast with. So if we look here, this is April 4, 2018, and this is the astrological chart, the April 4th, 2018 right here. And right away we see that Mars is conjunct, pretty close to conjunct Saturn, while retrograde Mercury is at its square Saturn. So in this particular situation, I would use the fastest planet first. It's one of the things when dealing with whether to do long-term or shorter terms, like I was just talking about. I decided when looking at the fast planets, making relationships to the slow planets, I wanted to do shorter-term forecasts. I also decided that it was most beneficial, logically speaking, I hadn't tested it at that point, but probably be most beneficial to start with the relationship between the fastest slow planet and the fastest fast planet. Okay, now in this particular case, there's really just a relationship with Saturn, so we don't have to choose between the slow planets, but there are two fast planets here. We have Mercury and Mars, and of course Mercury moves faster than Saturn, so that's what I would look at. So all I would do, since this is retrograde, I know that it's going to go backwards, fall out of a relationship with Saturn here, this square, and then come back into the exact same relationship. So that's the first point in time that I would look at. And if I go forward, I see that this is, let me find out which degree exactly it was at. Let's see, let me get the calculator out here. Okay, so Mercury is at 360 plus 9.2 equals 369.2. Subtract out Saturn's 279 gives us its 90.2 degrees of separation. So it's right about the middle. So the aspect line turns on right there. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I go back 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that should be right about the middle there. So now I'm going to measure yet again, and I see that Mercury is at 368.5, and I subtract out Saturn's 279.1. That gives me 89.4, so that's close. Needs to be a little bit further. Right there, probably. Let's see. How much does Mercury move? 8.4 to 9.2. So that's going to be right about perfect right there. Okay, so I hope you just followed the math that I did. All I was doing was on April 4th, I was determining the exact separation between Saturn and Mercury, and then I moved the time forward until that exact separation was repeated, or as close as I could get to it, in day increments. So April 25th, 2018 would be the first date to look at. And April 25th shows up right here. It just happened to be the lowest price in a retracement. So what that means is we're starting out at a low here. We're looking for a top because we're trying to determine the end of the trend. When the first date comes, the first date or time period comes around that we have using this method, and it turns out to be a low, it almost certainly means that we're going to have continued movement to the upside. That's usually when it happens like this, that's the low of a retracement, and then the market continues to move up in the direction. So that means the next relationship that I would want to look at is going to be related to this square. We can go forward to the trine, which is May 18, 2018. And that shows us another very minor retracement right there. It's a bottom, not a top. Now here's the problem with this. This bottom right here is very close to this top right here. So you could look at it and say, oh, that's the top right there. See a second top come in and assume that that's going to be it. But because it actually shows up on a day that is a bottom of this, even though it's just a very minor retracement, you need to keep your eye on it because it's likely that it's just a retracement point in time and the market will continue to the upside. Now it can be the top. I mean, that could have been the top and then the market moved down. But if we move forward to the next relationship, which is a square, and the square, or not a square, I'm sorry, it's an opposition. The opposition is actually in relationship to the square where the trine is not. And what I mean by that is the opposition is exactly twice of the square, because the square is 90 degrees, the opposition is 180 degrees. So what I discovered is the likelihood of the trine working is lower than the likelihood of the opposition working, because the opposition is pretty much in the same family of aspects between the planets. Okay. Now as we move forward, we see that the opposition of Mercury and Saturn, you got June 15th. So it's just that one day, June 15th, 2018. And we get June 15th right there. It turns out it is the absolute high of this move right here. Now because that point in time lands at a high, especially after an explosive volatility move like this, you can fairly reliably look at that and say, okay, that's going to be the top of this particular market. Or I should say this particular trend in this market at this point in time. So we started with this low here in April, and then we had a top that was about 2.5 months away, not quite 2.5 months away. So like I said, this is the shorter term, because using the fast planet with the slow planet, we get shorter term stuff. Now, don't forget that we had a relationship between Mars and Saturn. It was a conjunction, which is in the same family as squares and oppositions. But it's also in the same family as trines and sextiles, because it's basically the birthplace of all family relationships, a conjunction is. So if we go forward in time with Mars, we see that Mars hits retrograde right here before we get to any significant relationship. And then we go forward in time. Excuse me. We see Mercury is actually coming back around to Saturn right here. But we're interested in Mars, there we go. Mars and Saturn, right about there, would be approximately the same. That's January 22nd, 2019. We see the January 22nd, 2019 is right at this high right here. Now, this is something else that I noticed. You would think that, okay, we're going to get a high from our fastest planet, which would be Mercury, which we did, and then we had a nice trend down here, but that the reaction or the relationship that Mars would have, since it's a slower planet, would be an even higher high. But what I realized, what I noticed is that you'll tend to get the opposite polarity. In other words, we started from a bottom, so we're looking for a top. And we have the top over here when Mars went 90 degrees, but it's not necessarily going to be higher than this top right there. So it's not a continuation of this particular trend necessarily. Now it could be, and we could look to see when Mars is in trine or in opposition, and we might find a higher top over here. But this takes us out of the time frame that we're looking at. We want to look at for swings that are a month, 2 months, 3 months long, not a year and a half long, and things of that nature. So because Mars was conjunct Saturn, and then Mars had that retrograde period, I would assume that Mars isn't really going to do a very good job in this particular instance, because it would be such a long amount of time. If Mars hadn't had that retrograde period in there, and then it would obviously be a shorter period of time, and I would look at it. But knowing that it's starting at a conjunction, it has a long ways to go. It has at least 60 degrees. Mars has at least 60 degrees to travel. So I hope that made sense. That was kind of unclear. What I'm saying is, if Mars was in, let's say Mars is in this 90-degree relationship with Saturn right here on the actual day that we're looking at to try and determine an end of a trend, and then we advance Mars, Mars is going to only have to move 30 degrees from this point to a trine. Okay? So that 30 degrees that Mars moves is only going to take a month and a half, something like that. So that's within the time frame that I'm looking for the trend to last, the swings that are a month to 2-3 months long. But because the amount of time it took Mars to go from conjunct Saturn to square or even sextile, because of the retrograde period, that took the time frame out way past the 3 months. So I'm not looking at Mars for this particular swing right here. Also, taking into the account that Mercury worked very well, so I would just not use Mars in that instance. Hopefully that made sense. I would start looking from here and then work my way down right there. So let's actually do that. That is June 15th, 2018. All right. Move this back over here to June 15th, 2018. And of course, the most obvious thing that we have here is Mercury in opposition to Saturn. We also have Venus square Uranus. Now, Mercury is the faster of the fast planets, and Saturn is the faster of the slow planets, so that's what I would use first. In addition to that, the fact that we have already used Mercury and Saturn would indicate that that would be the preferable pair to use. Now, if we advance forward, we see that we get retrograde period for Mercury, and then we hit the trine. The trine for Mercury with Saturn, but also Uranus right there. That's September 7th, 2018, which comes out to right here. September 7th, 2018. Now, this is actually, we're looking for a low, and this is the lowest low up to this point right here. So this would be, okay, well, we're looking at this, and we would assume that we have the end of the downtrend. Now, obviously, the very lowest price was right here. But this isn't a square which is in the same family as the opposition. The trines are not in the opposition family. So let's see what happens when we go to a square. Here, right around September 21st, 22nd, we see that we actually get this low right here that's a little bit lower. Now, this is important. This is one other thing that I noticed. Excuse me. And that is that sideways markets count as trends, right? So the fact that the trine pointed us to right here, and then the square pointed us to down here, this is all part of a different trend. Instead of continuing to move down, I mean, it did move down, but it was sideways here, right up here. And it pretty much started going sideways here, although we could count it starting right here. So that's something that you need to be aware of, is the relationship that the outcome of these forecasts are going to have with sideways markets. Because it really, these sideways type markets right here really messed with the outcome of the forecast until I realized, well, wait a minute, sideways market is the third direction of a trend. You can trend up, you can trend down, and you can trend sideways. So then it started to become more and more clear to me that you have to take into account the sideways markets. Now, we'll go back really quickly. We were square, Venus and Uranus right there. So let's go back to where they were in opposition. Let's go back to June 15th so we can see, try and do things a bit more exact. Okay, Venus was 122.5 minus Uranus 31.48. I'm just going to say 5 because it's close enough. So that's 91 degrees. So that's 1 degree past the square. So we go to the opposition right here, and 32.1. So we want 3.1. So right here, September 13, 2018. And we get, it doesn't really show anything right here. Very close to this day right here. So this could be considered the end, this whole period right here, the end of the trend down. And then all this would be the sideways move that we would try and forecast. So let's do that. We have the first day of the sideways move right here, September 7th, 2018. And we have right here the Sun and Jupiter kind of in a relationship, the Sun in opposition to Neptune, and Mercury trine Saturn and Uranus right there. So let's move forward till Mercury is, we already saw Mercury square Saturn September 22nd. That would be the first thing to look at. And we obviously are not forecasting the end of the trend with that date. So we're going to go to Mercury being in opposition to Uranus, or Uranus, October 10, 2018, 9 and 10. Right there. So that would be the end of the sideways move right there. And at first glance on that day, we would assume, oh, we're going to continue to the downside, but we don't. Obviously, it makes a bottom there, and then we have a trend to the upside like that. So what would we do in that situation? We would first use this day right here as the day of the end of the sideways trend, and we would anticipate that the market was going to move down. But after looking at it for several days, and especially by the time it gets here, we see, oh, the market's moving up. This was actually just the bottom point of this particular trend. So I would anticipate that the market's moving up, because remember, our swings are shorter term, not longer term. So we would actually be forecasting from a low point or the end of this market to a high, although it's not particularly obvious at this point in time. So there are going to be points where that's just how it is, where you can't really tell right away if we're at a bottom or not, and it's all because of these terrible sideways markets. Sideways trends, I should say. All right, so October 10, we have Mercury in a relationship with Saturn. We have Mercury also in a relationship with Uranus. So Mercury is in a 60-degree relationship with Saturn. So let's see what happens with that first. We went retrograde there. Now Mercury is conjunct Saturn there, and that's January 13th, 2019. And we actually get a lower top right there. If we look at Mercury and Uranus, we see that we are square right here. October 10. Okay, yeah, I just want to make sure that we were in opposition, pretty tight opposition there. Okay, so square Uranus right there, January 22nd, 2019, and that gives us this point in time right here. So we're looking at the end of this little sideways trend right here. So that's kind of an indication, that's a little hint right there. One thing that I noticed is that certain planets are going to have relationships in certain markets more frequently than not. And for instance, Twitter, the market we're looking at here, we see that Mercury and Saturn seem to be having a lot of relationships that are calling the turns in the market. Also, we have Mercury and Uranus right here, but they have different relationships. We're getting sideways trend type stuff happening with Uranus. So even though we started from essentially a low here, the end of this particular sideways trend, as far as this is concerned, we moved up. We're getting the Mercury and the Saturn relationship where we have a lower top here. So we're not getting a retracement. I'd really like to see this land, this particular relationship between Mercury and Saturn, land on a retracement or a low, since we're looking for a high here. And that will tell us for certain, or very close to certain, I should say, that the market's going to continue higher. But we didn't. We landed on a high. So it could very well be that this is the last high of this area right here. But I think that we most likely will see a higher high round about the time Mercury is 60 degrees from Saturn. So February 18th, something like that, we could see a higher top in the market right there. Unless we're already topping right here and we're just going to go lower. The other possibility is we might get a retracement at this point in time, and we would have to look for Mercury trine Saturn for the top. But I'm going to go ahead and end this part, or this video for now, not this part, but this video, because we're very close to 30 minutes long right now. So basically the recap is I started looking at the market and noticed that to use the faster planet and the slower planet like I originally started with, I really need to stick with shorter term trends that are just a month, 2 months, 3 months, maybe 4 months long, something along those lines. And that the longer term trends were going to have to be dealt with in a different manner. Now, I also noticed that these sideways moves, some markets don't have really big sideways moves very frequently. Like Tesla has a lot of up and down, sharp tops, sharp bottoms. It's one of the reasons I like to trade that market. A lot of stocks like Twitter, for instance, tend to have meandering sideways moves, or where they don't move very much price area up or down over a period of time of a month or 2 months or 3 months, something like that. And so I realized that I needed to start treating the sideways markets as trends also, and that alleviated a lot of the issues that I was having. So at the end of this video, that's the point. I mean, I've taken you to that point of my development of this system. In the next video, we're going to talk about a few other things where I progressed and continue to do things to improve this system, because I wanted to make it as user-friendly, I guess I'll just say user-friendly as possible, where I had to, how should I say it, use as few qualifiers as possible. Obviously, you're going to need to use more than just 1 or 2 qualifiers, and by qualifiers I mean you have to keep in mind the fact that, like, for instance, with fast and slow planets, you're going to need shorter trends. You're also going to have to keep in mind that the sideways moves are a possibility. And also, I want to point this out, as you've seen, these points in times that come from the planets, like I'm showing in the series, give you possible points for the end of the trend. It's not, you don't want to just sit there and go, okay, that's the exact end of the trend for sure, because you don't know. These are just points in time that give you a possibility. So anyway, I'm going to stop talking now because it's been over 30 minutes and my voice is getting a little tired. So I will continue this series probably another week or 2 from today. So until then, I'll talk to you later.